The file was already in my inbox when I woke up. Subject line, updated deal closing agenda, internal review only. No greeting, no explanation, just a clean attachment in PDF format, sent at 6:04 a.m. by someone I'd trained 6 months earlier. I opened it without emotion. The file was 6 pages, structured, confident, rehearsed. My name, Nina, was not on it. The page that should have listed me as strategic advisor, Section 4, signature blocks, was now filled with people who hadn't built a single part of the structure. The replacement listed under execution lead was Darren Wu, a junior executive with 2 years of experience and none of the scars. The same Darren who used to ask me how to phrase risk disclosures, the same Darren who once needed help spelling subsidiary in an email draft. Now he was signing off on a deal worth $1.2 billion. I didn't reply. I didn't forward the email. I didn't call anyone. I just closed the file, got dressed, and walked into the conference suite like nothing had changed. They didn't expect that. The room was already filling when I arrived. High-end suits, soft voices, too much cologne, screens mirrored across 3 displays, folders stacked neatly. I recognized every line of the deck, every phrase, every number, because I wrote most of it. At the head of the table sat Mark Harrell, CEO of Vestron Capital. 48, polished, sharp when it benefited him. He gave me a polite nod, the kind you give to someone who still has keys to a door you're about to lock. "Nina," he said, "glad you could make it. Today's run-through will be tighter, just principles and legal. The actual signing team." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "This deck looks fantastic," he added, gesturing to the binder in front of him. "Appreciate all the heavy lifting to get us here." I nodded once, didn't smile, didn't speak, just walked past the table and took a seat along the back wall. Not at the table, not in the circle, just close enough to watch. Darren spoke next. He stood like someone who had practiced it, feet square, blazer buttoned, one hand on the slide remote. His voice was steady, but too fast. You could hear the pride in every word, like he believed saying them out loud would make them his. "Today's structure follows the phased equity model we've discussed," he began. "Clean separation, minimal overlap, and risk-neutral timing." I watched him flip through pages I'd spent weeks designing. I watched him talk about alignment clauses, staggered reporting thresholds, and delayed visibility mechanics. He was using the words correctly, but he didn't know what any of them meant, not really. He called one section a timeline efficiency clause. It wasn't. It was a trigger mechanism, a safeguard I'd embedded that required careful timing. Use it too early, and it raised a red flag with regulators. Leave it too long, and it collapsed the entire flow of the deal. He'd left it untouched, reused it, but misunderstood its purpose. I didn't correct him. I let him keep going. I let him walk through a structure he thought was safe because it looked good on slides, without knowing where the pressure points lived, because they'd cut me out of the deal. But they hadn't removed the system I'd built, and that was going to cost them. At 9:43 a.m., the presentation ended. Polite claps, tight smiles. One of the external legal partners leaned over and whispered something to Darren. He laughed, soft, rehearsed, like he belonged here. Mark stood up and offered closing remarks about vision and discipline. They talked about legacy like it was something already secured. No one looked at me. They thought I was done, forgotten, disposable. That was perfect. I stood slowly, picked up my notebook, walked toward the door. As I passed the far wall, I paused briefly at the whiteboard. Someone had written a slogan across the top in thick marker: simplify, accelerate, own. 3 words that sounded bold enough to sell, but vague enough to hide behind. I took out my phone, snapped a photo, no caption, no post, just record keeping, because this wasn't over. It hadn't even started. The moment they erased my name, they created a blind spot, the kind that regulators notice, the kind that unravels billion-dollar dreams. And the best part? They didn't even know what they were standing on. But I did, because I'd built it. And now I was going to let it collapse, quietly, legally, and completely, under its own stolen weight. I didn't go to law school. I didn't come from finance. I came from the quiet part of every meeting, the part where someone says, "Can we make this cleaner?" And everyone else looks away. That was always me. The cleaner. I joined Vestron Capital 13 years ago as a junior compliance assistant. It was the kind of title that made people forget your name before the meeting ended. But I was good with structure, with flow. I could look at a 300-page merger proposal and tell you where the delay would come from before it ever showed up on a regulator's desk. I didn't talk much. I didn't network. I stayed late, flagged the right risks, and let other people take the credit when deals closed. That's how I built my space. Quietly, one risk avoided, one deal salvaged, one executive who didn't get caught doing something reckless because I quietly rearranged the paperwork to stop them. That's how I learned. Power isn't about who signs the document. It's about who makes sure it survives being read. And over time, that became my job. I became the fixer behind the fixers. The first deal I took over completely was 6 years ago. 2 companies, overlapping board members, hidden investment accounts. Their in-house team called it a mess with potential. It should have died in pre-review. I cut it into pieces, rewrote the timeline, separated appointments, cleaned the equity map until it was invisible to any surface-level audit. It closed in under 90 days, no flags, no delays. That's when Mark Harrell, who was still just SVP then, started calling me for special projects. He never said the word gray area, but we both knew what it meant. If a deal had something that could trigger questions, too many ties, too much movement, too little time, he called me. I didn't cover things up. I didn't delete evidence. That wasn't the point. I made things just clean enough to pass through the system without anyone asking twice. Not illegal, just untraceable. When the Vestron-Hallberg deal first came up, I knew it was going to be a test. The numbers were big. The overlap was messy. The 2 CEOs had once sat on the same nonprofit board, one of those connections no one remembers until it suddenly matters. It wasn't a problem yet, but it could be. So I did what I always did. I slowed the deal down, just enough to make it invisible. I rewrote the asset flow. I mapped the ownership paths so that no single person ever looked like they had control from both sides. I split the timeline across quarters so that no report ever showed all the activity in one place. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean, and it would have worked if they'd left it alone. But somewhere along the way, Darren Wu started showing up in meetings he didn't belong in. He was fresh, loud, shiny. He said things like, "Speed is leverage," and "Don't overthink clean." At first, I thought he was temporary. A face for the board, someone to smile on camera while I did the wiring in the dark. Then I noticed him quoting my language, my phrasing, on calls I hadn't been invited to. He repeated something I'd written about tiered risk buffering and called it his strategy. That was the first signal. The second was when Mark stopped CCing me on internal drafts. The third was when I saw a transition memo naming Darren as the public lead for the transaction. They didn't say I was being removed. They just started acting like I never existed, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But here's the thing. When you've spent your entire career making things almost too clean, you know what to watch for. You know where the cracks are. You know which clause, if triggered too early, sets everything in motion. And I had left one in the structure. Not by accident, by design. It was buried in one of the timing conditions, something simple, something they didn't understand. If a board member on one side of the deal had a connection to a holding company on the other side, and if that holding company wasn't visible on public filings for at least 90 days, it had to be reported to federal regulators. That clause was like a pressure switch. As long as you moved carefully, it stayed quiet. But if you rushed, if you tried to speed up the deal, the switch went off. And Darren? He was built for rushing. I never told anyone about that clause. I never flagged it in red, never labeled it important. I didn't need to, because I knew the moment someone removed me and reused my system without understanding it, that clause would activate. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to attract attention. And in this world, attention is fatal. They thought they could copy my work and win without me. What they didn't realize was, I didn't design the system to make them rich. I designed it to survive the people who'd try to take credit. 3 days after I was cut, I lost access. Not with a phone call, not with an official note, just one red bar at the top of the screen. Permission denied. Contact administrator. It was the shared drive where we stored all regulatory prep, draft filings, clause audits, risk maps, the same folders I'd structured from scratch, now scrubbed of my clearance. At first I thought it was a mistake, so I tried the next one, our deal tracking dashboard, same result. Then the vendor clearance archive, locked, no warning, no explanation. Just silence, sealed with polite digital language. I checked the system logs. My name had been moved from tiered oversight to legacy contributor, a category reserved for people who had left the company or were about to. It wasn't a mistake, it was a rewrite, and they thought I wouldn't notice. But I didn't react. I didn't reply. I didn't escalate. I took a screenshot, dated it, archived it, then I opened a personal folder they couldn't touch, a folder I'd kept for years. It was called Inheritance. Inside were version maps, not documents, not evidence, just the bones of the deal. Every clause, every delay, every timing split I'd embedded to keep the structure from tripping alarms. They hadn't edited any of them. They'd just polished the top layer and stamped their names on the cover. The system still followed my rules, but now it was being rushed by people who didn't speak the language, and I could already see the fractures. The first came from a slip. An internal contact, someone in vendor onboarding, forwarded a draft invoice to the wrong inbox. Mine. The invoice referenced a holding company I didn't recognize. Small name, short history. But when I ran a quiet lookup through a public records tool, the address matched one of Halberg's affiliated funds. Nothing illegal, but it wasn't on any of the public filings. Not listed, not disclosed, not aged. I checked the registration date. 81 days ago, which meant that if any Vestron board member had touched it, signed off, authorized a fund transfer, or initiated a clause, it would violate the 90-day disclosure buffer I had hard-coded into the structure. A fuse had been lit, and they didn't even know they were holding the match. Later that week, I scanned the updated closing timeline on the investor site. They'd moved the final filing window 2 weeks earlier than planned, probably to impress stakeholders or to accelerate shareholder value, as Darren would have said. But that change pushed the entire schedule forward, right into the zone where that 90-day clause would wake up. I didn't need to be inside to know it had triggered. That clause wasn't a bomb, it was a siren. Silent at first, but timed to echo where it mattered. I didn't speak to anyone inside Vestron after that, but I didn't need to. I had built the kind of system where sloppiness echoes, and I started hearing echoes everywhere. A former legal analyst sent me a text. They're rewriting language again. Something about reducing complexity. Darren looks nervous. Then a compliance contractor I'd worked with once messaged me on LinkedIn. Is it true the new structure doesn't have buffer clauses because the SEC is sniffing around again? Just rumor? Just rumor. That was the phrase I'd been waiting for. Because rumors mean someone is trying to fix something without admitting it broke, and fixing it wouldn't be simple. Because the trap wasn't in the visible lines. It was in the logic underneath. I opened the original clause file. Line 47. Simple. If board connection equals true and holding visibility less than 90 days, require disclosure. No one had deleted it. No one had flagged it. They just copied the file and used it faster than it was meant to move. I didn't write that line to stop the deal. I wrote it to test whether the people using it understood it, and now the answer was clear. They didn't. That night, I reopened a secure mailbox I hadn't touched in 4 years. Inside was one contact, Lena Monroe. She used to work under me before she joined the SEC. Now she was listed as a senior analyst in market integrity. I didn't send an accusation. I didn't make a claim. I just forwarded the structure file, annotated lightly, no names, no labels, just a subject line. One of your flagged risk patterns might be active. Thought you should know. And then I closed the laptop, because by then I didn't need to speak. I had done enough. The structure was already talking for me. They didn't know I was still watching. By the time they noticed the heat, I had already prepared the file. Nothing dramatic, no threat, just logic, stripped of names, dates, logos. The architecture was the evidence. The timeline did the rest. The document lived in a personal vault I kept outside the company network. Triple synced, quiet, the kind of storage that doesn't show up on subpoena logs unless you know exactly where to look, and no one ever does. I didn't label it evidence. I labeled it sequence fail, because that's what it was, a sequence problem, a set of moves that only worked when played in the right order. Darren had shuffled it. Hallberg had rushed it. Mark had smoothed it over with language that was 3 clicks too confident. And now they were standing on a structure that didn't want to hold them. I didn't have to push. I just had to stay out of the way. After I sent the clause to Lena, I didn't follow up. We had a system. No calls, no emails, no traceable contact unless she needed clarification. She didn't respond, which meant the document spoke for itself, and it had. Because 2 days later, an obscure government scheduling page updated quietly with a phrase I knew well. Preliminary Structural Review, Vestron Hallberg Proposal. It wasn't a formal investigation. It wasn't public. But it meant a pre-screening analyst had opened the file, and when they saw what I'd marked, they wouldn't be able to unsee it. Meanwhile, I organized the rest of my tools, not to fight them, to understand them. There's a window in every corporate mess, just before it unravels, when everyone inside starts acting polite again, not friendly, just smooth, careful. Like they're hoping silence will outpace consequence. That was the window I'd been waiting for. I logged into a dummy news aggregator I'd built years ago. It pulled data from forums, internal job postings, and press feeds, not for headlines, for metadata. The pattern was unmistakable. Legal hires ramped up. Executive assistants updated LinkedIn locations, but not titles. Hallberg paused 3 other deals with no explanation. I didn't need confirmation from Lena. The structure was buckling. At 1:18 p.m. the next day, I got a forwarded message from a junior analyst still inside the org. No context, just the header. Internal review brief. Red line version, confidential. I didn't open the full file. I didn't need to. The title told me everything. They were rewriting my structure, and that meant the clause had triggered. Most people think a whistleblower brings the house down. That's not true. Not in this world. In this world, a whisper at the right time lets gravity do the rest. You don't blow the house down. You quietly remove one support beam. And then you listen. I spent the rest of the week mapping names to fingerprints. Who had reused what? Who had signed without reading? Who had benefited from erasing me? I didn't need vengeance. I needed clarity, because once the system failed in public view, those names would either vanish, resign, or send carefully crafted emails that didn't include the word sorry. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was building context so that when the collapse happened, and it would, no one could claim they hadn't been warned. The final move wasn't legal. It wasn't personal. It was technical. I repackaged my original compliance logic into a plain language template. No names, no branding, just a clean explanation of how disclosure delays can hide board overlap for exactly 89 days before triggering a reporting violation. I posted it on a public policy blog under an alias I'd used for years. The blog had maybe 200 readers, mostly academics, a few watchdog types, 1 or 2 former regulators, but it would get indexed. And if anyone searched for patterns behind the Vestron deal, they'd find it. Not as a weapon, as a mirror. And the people looking into it wouldn't be angry. They'd be interested. That's all it ever took. Not shouting, not lawsuits, just interest from the right person at the wrong time. That's how billion-dollar deals die. Not in headlines, in memos. The first mention came from a finance blogger with 6,000 followers. He wasn't important, but he was fast. He posted a single sentence. Hearing chatter that Vestron's deal might be in trouble. Anyone else seeing early-stage red lines? No sources, no link, just a ripple in the digital water. By noon, it had been quoted by 3 larger accounts. By 4 p.m., it was in a newsletter with the headline, "Something's off with Vestron, but no one's talking." That was the moment the silence turned into a signal. Because in this space, people don't panic when there's noise. They panic when someone makes a sound, and everyone else goes quiet. The official statement came at 6:03 p.m. from Vestron's PR desk. "We remain committed to regulatory alignment and are cooperating fully with standard pre-approval protocols." That sentence is corporate code for, "We're not in control anymore." The press didn't need details. The absence of certainty was enough. Vestron stock fell 4% overnight. The next morning, it opened down 7%. By lunch, it was 10%. Halberg, the company trying to acquire Vestron, refused to comment. Their head of legal postponed 2 speaking events. Then they rescheduled a planned investor Q&A call for scheduling conflicts. The market heard what wasn't said, and it moved accordingly. Meanwhile, the real damage was happening underground. Inside Vestron, internal review teams were combing through the deal documents. They weren't looking for mistakes. They were looking for who had known what and when. I wasn't there to hear it, but I saw the pattern. Emails slowed, LinkedIn updates froze, recruiters started making quiet calls to employees with no clear reason. That's what collapse looks like in real time. Not flames, not headlines, just people trying to move sideways before the floor gives out. On day 3, the clause made it into the press, not by name, not word for word, but a journalist from Market Signal posted this. According to sources, the deal may have used a timing model that avoided standard board relationship disclosure windows. If true, it could raise regulatory concerns. That line wasn't written for the public. It was written for the analysts, the institutional ones, the slow money. They read that sentence and stopped moving forward. And in finance, stopping is death. Halberg pulled out on day 5. They didn't issue a statement. They didn't schedule a call. They just filed an adjustment to deal terms that reclassified the merger as pending indefinite review. It was their way of saying, "We're leaving, but we want to pretend we might come back." They wouldn't. They couldn't. The structure was compromised. The language had reached too many people, and even if regulators didn't charge anyone, the deal was already poisoned. I didn't gloat. I didn't post. I watched a live stream of a financial roundtable where one of Vestron's board members tried to explain the failure. He said things like misaligned optics and exposure timing variance. All words, no truth. The truth was this: they built a billion-dollar deal on a structure they didn't understand. They rushed it. They cut out the person who had built the walls, and then they blamed the air for getting in. At 11:22 a.m. on day 7, Financial Scope reported the following. Federal regulators have issued an $18 million penalty to Vestron Capital for misrepresenting timeline integrity during the attempted merger. That sentence was written for shareholders, but I knew who it really spoke to. Darren, Mark, the people who thought clean slides could hide messy logic, the people who thought the person in the background didn't matter. They never saw me, and now they couldn't, because I wasn't in the room. I was in the collapse. Mark Harrell resigned before the quarter closed. The statement was short. After more than a decade of service, Mark Harrell will be stepping down as CEO to explore new opportunities and spend more time with his family. They always say that part, spend more time with family, like it softens the exit. But the markets knew what it meant. He didn't leave. He was removed. And the people who removed him didn't do it out of justice. They did it out of necessity. Vestron had to survive, and Mark had become part of the risk. Darren disappeared 2 days later, not officially, but quietly. His LinkedIn changed to open to work. His email bounced. The interns who used to hover around his desk started whispering to the new compliance hire. I never saw a headline with his name. That was the point. No one needed the noise. They just needed the system to expel the mistake without drawing blood. That's how real corporate systems work. No fire, just silent cleanup. Inside Vestron, something shifted. Not all at once, not visibly, but deep down in the structure. A new chief compliance officer was installed. Her name was Margaret Shin. I'd worked with her years ago, sharp, patient, the kind of professional who never made the same mistake twice. She didn't call me. She didn't have to. Because the first policy she rolled out was a revision of the old timing model, complete with a line I recognized from my original clause. No board-level exposure to unfiled assets inside a 90-day window. They'd rewritten it in friendlier language. But the spine was mine. And they were using it now. By the third quarter, Vestron had a new audit process. They outsourced all future deal structure reviews to a third-party firm, one I'd consulted for years ago, under a different name. The irony didn't matter. The system had stabilized, and the people who once erased me were now working under rules I'd written in silence. That's what real control looks like. Not being at the top of the flowchart, being the person who built the filter they now can't bypass. An old colleague forwarded me an internal newsletter Vestron circulated that month. It celebrated a new era of operational integrity. There was no mention of me, no quote, no attribution, just a bulleted line. We've implemented new guardrails that ensure long-term deal transparency. I read that line twice, then I archived it, not because I needed credit, but because I needed confirmation. 1 week later, I received an anonymous request through a private inbox I kept open for one purpose. The message read, "We're restructuring our advisory review flow and looking for an outside perspective, quiet, strategic, discreet. Would you be open to reviewing our architecture?" No name, no branding. But the language told me everything. They were trying to build something that wouldn't break the same way again. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for someone to prevent another Nina. And the irony was, they were writing to me. I didn't reply immediately. I walked to the lake near my apartment. Quiet neighborhood, cold air, clear sky. No one knew my name out here. I liked it that way. I sat on the bench I'd claimed as my own and reread the message on my phone. I didn't need them to know who I was. I didn't need them to see my face. All I needed was access, because the people in the room weren't the ones in charge. The person in charge was always the one who knew how the walls were supposed to hold. And when they cracked, I was the only one who knew where the sealant was. I never told anyone it was me. Not the reporters, not the regulators, not the junior analysts still using the files I left behind. There was no glory in it, just completion. That was enough. Because revenge isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about releasing your name from the thing it was buried in and watching what still stands without it. 6 months passed. The Vestron-Hallberg merger was never revived. Both companies moved on. They each signed smaller, quieter deals, deals that didn't make headlines, deals that passed compliance checks with room to spare. They'd learned, not because anyone gave a speech, because a silence had taught them. One night I received a LinkedIn connection request from someone at Hallberg, a junior compliance officer. No message, no mutual contacts, just the kind of request people send when they've heard something, whispers maybe, and want to learn more, without asking directly. I declined it. Not out of secrecy, out of purpose, because what mattered wasn't whether they ever knew my name. What mattered was that they now feared what happens when they don't listen to the person who does. I gave one talk that year. Private group, 12 people, no photos, no recordings. The event title was forgettable. Something about operational thresholds in complex M&A architecture. Half the room was there for coffee and free pens. But one woman in the back row took notes the entire time. When I finished, she approached. Quietly. No name badge. She said, "You're the reason the clause exists now, aren't you?" I didn't answer. She smiled like she already knew. Then she said something I didn't expect. It was elegant. The way it unraveled. Like watching a clock run backwards until the mechanism cracked. I nodded once. That was all. The next morning I posted something on my own LinkedIn. First post in over a year. No hashtags, no links. Just a photo. It was the corner of a whiteboard. A single red marker arrow pointed from the word ownership to a block labeled timing equals truth. Below it, a small line in my handwriting. Too early is exposure. Too late is cover-up. The right time is silence. No one liked it at first. Then someone from Hallberg reposted it. Then someone from Vestron's board. No comments, just echoes. I turned off notifications that night. Let the algorithm bury it. That's how I prefer legacy anyway. Not loud, not viral, just deep enough that when the next person opens the file, when they reach the clause, when they feel the tension built into the language, they'll pause, not because they know who wrote it, but because something in the structure tells them, "Be careful, someone smarter than you built this." And that's the moment I was always aiming for. Not recognition, respect, the kind that doesn't need a name, just a shadow in the system they'll never fully erase.